Supreme Court nominee Elena Kagan spent the last 2 days making the rounds, as you've surely seen, with members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. They were cordial, these meet and greet sessions, and they were fairly positive by most accounts. But Kagan has now come under fire over her record on race when she was the dean of Harvard's law school. Some African-American leaders and scholars are troubled by her hiring practices. She was there for 6 years, and during that tenure, she hired 43 full-time faculty members. Most of them were white men and women. Minorities included 2 African-American men, 1 Indian man, and 1 Asian-American woman. Boyce Watkins is a professor and resident scholar at Syracuse University. He's also a contributor to thegrio.com. And Ronald Sullivan is a professor at Harvard Law School. He was hired by Elena Kagan. He's also the director of the Harvard Criminal Justice Institute. To both of you, I appreciate your time. Professor Watkins,
thank you for having me.
We'll begin with you. You accuse Elena Kagan of systematic racism, as you describe it. Why?
Well, number one, we know that we're about 200 years too late when it comes to putting a black woman on the Supreme Court. So that right there is the first level of disappointment. But that's not Elena's fault. What's interesting is that when you look at her hiring record, where she hired many dozens of tenure and tenure-track faculty, and not one of them was African American, Latino, or Native American, that's incredibly problematic. David Duke couldn't have a worse hiring record than Elena Kagan did at Harvard. And so ultimately we have to ask ourselves, when are we going to call it for what it is?
Professor, we're not comparing her to David Duke in terms of her opinions, just in terms of her record.
She's certainly not David Duke, absolutely not, but we do know that there is a virtual cesspool of systemic racism at Harvard University. Now, if you assume that Elena Kagan was incredibly powerless and didn't have the ability to stop it, then the only argument you can make is that she wasn't racist, but everyone else at the Harvard Law School is racist, and that she's the ringleader of this incredibly problematic hiring practice.
Professor, let me bring in Professor Sullivan quickly. Arguably, no elite law school has done enough with respect to minority hiring. I think we all agree to that. But you credit Elena Kagan for declining to take a professorship at Harvard that was named for a family that earned its fortune, its money, from the slave trade. So should African Americans be concerned?
Well, I think that's a positive for Elena Kagan. Obviously, it's the Royal Professorship of Law. Tradition dictated that deans of the Harvard Law School would hold the Royal Professorship of Law. That's the endowed chair that the deans would hold. Elena came in and declined to take that professorship because, as you say, the money that endowed that chair was derived from the transatlantic slave trade. Instead, Dean Kagan said that I will be the first holder of the Charles Hamilton Houston professorship.
So shouldn't African Americans feel good about that? I mean, clearly, she recognized a lot of the community's concerns.
I think that's one thing African Americans should feel good about. Another thing African Americans should feel good about was during her deanship, the percentage of African American students admitted to the Harvard Law School raised from around 10% to 13%. And I recall very clearly coming back for an alumni event where blacks from all over the country celebrated then Dean Kagan for increasing the numbers of black students, and particularly black men who were represented at dismal levels. A very quick word about the hiring,
very briefly,
because I don't want to gloss. Yeah, I don't want to gloss over that. Harvard, every elite law school has to do much better in terms of hiring. But to say that the dean hired people or didn't hire people is too strong. Likewise, to say that the dean was powerless is too strong. But instead, the faculty, entire faculty, has to vote on hiring. It's a very complicated process. The dean is very powerful in that process.
But what about when she was Solicitor General?
Responsible.
But when she was Solicitor General, she didn't hire any black people, any Native Americans, or any Latino people there either. Are we going to continue to say that she was powerless, and are we going to give her credit for admitting black students, but yet deny her culpability for not hiring black faculty?
And Professor,
we have to hold people accountable on this. We have to be honest.
Professor Watkins and Professor Sullivan, we're going to leave it there for now. The conversation is going to continue, of course, as she makes the rounds on the Capitol and as her hearings head up to the Capitol coming up the next several weeks. Thanks to both you gentlemen.
Great, thank you.
Another significant